Hello, my name is Alexandre Pinto. I am the president of the Portuguese Society Geotechnical Board. I would like to welcome you to our webinar. Today, the subject is sustainable and risk-based contaminated sites management, and we have the pleasure to have with us today the Professor Paul Bardos. The Portuguese Geotechnical Society, we have a long history. At the moment, we have about 500 members. Our objective is to spread the geotechnical know-how through the technical and the scientific community. We have at the moment four committees. We are going to have a fifth committee very shortly, but I cannot not announce it by the moment. We have four committees: the tunnels committee, the geotechnical transportation committee, the geosynthetics committee, and the environmental geotechnics committee, which is now the responsible for the organization of this webinar. I would like also to thank the organization, the Contaminated Land Working Group of the Environmental Geotechnical Committee of the SPG, the Portuguese Geotechnical Society. I would like to thank also the LENEC for the support at the organization. And I also would like to thank the supporting entities, the Technical Association for the Study of Soil and Groundwater Contamination, and the Portuguese Association of Environmental Technology Companies. So I will thank all of you to be present today at this webinar, and mainly I would like to thank Professor Paul Bardos for his availability to be here at our webinar today, and I wish all of you an excellent webinar. Thank you very much. I will ask now Ms. Celeste to proceed with the presentation. Thank you.
Hello, hi everyone. And I would like to open this session, and I just need to open the correct file because I closed it. Okay, I would like to welcome everyone, and I would like to thank Professor Paul Bardos for his availability, for his collaboration with CPGA. For the introduction, I would like to say some words, and after I will read the biography of Professor Paul Bardos. And for the introduction, I would say that soil is one of the environmental compartments, and its conditions are reflected in the quality of the others: water, air, and even biota, because all the environmental compartments are interrelated. And sedimentals are in between the soil and surface water compartments. Soil is responsible for groundwater depuration, surface water quality, air features, and biota health. Soil contamination is one of the main threats affecting soil health worldwide. In some circumstances, it is difficult to perceive the grade of contamination of the soil, but when the level of contamination is high and soil functions are threatened or even destroyed, the soil pollution is assumed. In both cases, the soil quality degradation causes acute effects on the ecosystem and human health. The Industrial Revolution in Europe brought in the last two centuries the generation of important negative repercussions resulting from natural resources, exploitation of, and industrial production processes, causing soil, water, air quality degradation. The technical development increased these situations due to the huge progress in the production, and all of these development brought the generation of contaminants of different kinds in enormous quantities. In theory, all countries have contaminated or polluted soil, but the importance of this situation is dependent on their extent, dominant contaminants, and level of contamination, which result in the level of industriation industrialization, and the main source of contamination. The cost of remediating contaminated soil is high, both economically and environmentally, and require advanced technologies. Nowadays, sustainable management of contaminated sites is being required. And now I'm going to pass to the CV of Professor Paul Bardos. Professor Paul Bardos is chartered environmentalist with more than 20 years of experience in soil science and biology, contaminated land and brownfields, waste treatment and risk management, particularly in biological treatments technologies, sustainability assessment, soil and water issues, with more than 300 publications on this subject. He has been managing director of R3, which he established in 1997. Prior to 1997, he worked with Nottingham Trade University, and before that, a UK government research institute, the Warren Spring Laboratory. He has worked with a wide range of clients worldwide, including multinationals, businesses, stakeholders networks, and government agencies. He is visiting professor at the University of Reading and visiting research at the University of Southampton. He is co-chair of the steering group of the Sustainable Remediation Forum in the UK of CLARE, that is a registered charity and environmental body, and an author of the Nicole Roadmap on Sustainable Remediation Network for Industrially Contaminated Land in Europe. And he has a contributor of ISO 2017 18504 from soil quality guidance on sustainable remediation, and he provides technical support on eco-efficient evaluation of production value chain in China. He is also an expert consultant for the government of China and the World Bank on sustainable and risk-based remediation for World Bank project in Kosovo. He is a consultant for the government agency AIST in Tokyo for the sustainable reuse of contaminated soil in the impacted area of Fukushima. He has carried out a number of remediation project evaluations and audits for various public and private sector clients around the world, including remediation sustainability assessment in the UK, Czech Republic, France, Germany, Italy, and Poland. He is a partner in several leading edge of research and development projects related to advanced bioremediation, production of biofibers on brownfields, use of soils, and management of persistent organic pollutant. After this introduction of soil contamination and presentation of Paul Bardos, I invite Professor Paul Bardos to take the floor. Please. I invite you.
Thank you very much, Celeste, for a wonderful introduction, and to you, Alexandro. I really appreciate it very much. I'm going to share my presentation now. Can someone confirm that they can see the presentation okay?
Okay, it's okay, Paul.
Thanks, Celeste. So today I'm going to talk to you over the next 50 to 60 minutes about sustainable and risk-based land management of contaminated sites, which is the modern paradigm really for managing polluted land internationally. This work is based this paper is based on work that I've done largely for the World Bank in China, and I'd like to acknowledge my authors from the Ministry of Environment and Ecology, Zhiting Xiao, Ren Yong, and Yinyu Lao. They've been excellent colleagues to work with. And what I'm going to go through really. This paper is an overview of a book that's coming out on sustainable and risk-based land management later in the year that's been supported by this project in China. Hopefully this book will come out on Amazon at a very low cost, particularly if we can get it sponsored. So without further ado, let's go into the talk itself. Excuse me. So the contents of the presentation across 12 sections, a very brief review of the scale of contaminated land problems, and then some take-home messages. So even if you can't stay for the full time, then this brief series of four slides will really carry the take-home messages from the presentation. And then I'll go into the talk in a bit more detail. Triggers for contaminated sites management, why we do it, the stakeholders who are important in this process, the idea of using conceptual site models to manage sites management, and the processes of contaminated land or contaminated site management, site investigation, risk assessment, risk management, the various options we have for remediation, how we deliver and implement it. And then I'll close with this new idea of sustainable remediation, and a few conclusions, maybe a decision support framework. There's nothing new about contaminated land. Mark Twain, famous American author and coiner of good sayings, pointed out, by land, they ain't making it anymore. And that was, what, more than 200 years ago? So the scale of the problem. Well, in my country, the UK, our Environment Agency estimates that there are 300,000 potentially contaminated sites. The estimate for Europe is upwards of 2.5 million sites. Estimates in China are that there are perhaps 1 million sites requiring remediation. Japan has an estimate of 300,000 sites. And here we're talking about sites with point source problems, not diffuse land contamination. And this is an enormous problem. The costs are quite huge. So the contaminated land or contaminated sites management market in the UK is about £1 billion per year. Estimates for the EU, this was when the UK was in the EU, with €3 billion per year. Well, if you can imagine that one economy was contributing more than a third of that, and the scale of work in Germany and France is scarcely different, then you can see this estimate for the EU 28 of £3 billion per year must be an underestimate. In the USA, it's been estimated that to completely clean up all of the Superfund sites, and the Superfund are their most serious contaminated sites, will cost $110 billion US. An estimate for cleaning up contaminated sites in China is actually $1 trillion US. And the contaminated sites effort in Japan is estimated to be close on €1 billion per year. So this is just by way of giving you an idea of the scale of the problem and the responses that are underway. Now, I'd like to begin by showing you what sustainable remediation is in just a few minutes in this little animation. And Celeste, I'd be grateful if you can tell me that this all works okay.
I would say.
Have you got sound?
Not yet. No, not now, yes.
Now you have sound?
Yes.
Okay.
Wonderful.
Our industrial history has left behind a legacy of contaminated land and groundwater, which can present a risk to people and the environment. In some cases, the land remains in use, but in others, there is an opportunity for redevelopment. In either case, the risks from the contamination need to be managed, and this process is known as remediation. The technologies used in remediation have evolved over time, from simply removing the contaminated soil to landfill, or simply trying to pump out and treat contaminated groundwater, to more sophisticated and targeted solutions. However, even though it's done for good reasons, the process of remediation itself can have a negative impact on the environment and the surrounding community if not done well. So the focus has now shifted to encouraging stakeholder input into shaping a solution that avoids unacceptable environmental, social, and economic impacts and seeks more positive outcomes. This concept is known as sustainable remediation. Sustainable remediation has three key elements: environmental, economic, and social, which all need to be in balance and the impact of each considered. Overall, the goals of remediation must seek to protect human health and the wider environment. Any approach needs to be based on sound science, using clear evidence and a transparent decision-making process. The safety of workers and the general public must also be fully taken into account, along with the views of different stakeholders. To make these choices, we need a way to understand or assess sustainability. SURF UK has developed a guiding framework and a series of indicators which include environmental aspects encompassing soil, water and air, social aspects like the effect on health and communities, and economic aspects such as overall cost versus returns. Other effects that can be assessed include the impact on surrounding property values, be it detrimental or beneficial. It's also important to identify the circumstances that need to be considered in an assessment to ensure that options are compared on a like-for-like basis. Sometimes a solution can be shown to be sustainable using simple and basic methods of assessment. In other cases, a more complex assessment is needed. For this reason, a tiered approach is used, but always within the context and objectives set at the beginning. This begins as a qualitative approach and can become more quantitative if simpler approaches don't arrive at a clear answer. Greater gains can be achieved if sustainable remediation is considered early in the planning process, as this can affect the approach for different areas of the site, the risks to be managed, and the methods chosen to achieve a certain set of goals. SURF UK's framework for sustainable remediation and its supporting guidance is changing the face of remediation in the UK and helped shape a new ISO standard to support sustainable remediation around the world. For further information about SURF UK and sustainable remediation, visit www.clare.co.uk/SURF UK.
So I hope you enjoyed that little animation. It says more in a few minutes than I could manage in about 10 times that time. But I'll press on now with the rest of the slides. Celeste, can you just tell me if the slides are showing and moving properly again?
Yes, it's
fantastic. So I'm going to give a little nutshell really of sustainable and risk-based land management in 4 slides. And the first one is about what we mean by risk-based land management. And that's using the idea of risk assessment to determine how we're going to manage the land. So I'm sure all of you are aware of this idea of the source, the pathway, and the receptor. So the source is describing where the hazardous material is and its properties. The receptor is the group being affected. For example, human health, the environment, or water. And the pathway is linking the source to the receptor. Now, the risk will be present if these three things are together. If any one of them is not there, then there isn't a risk. This is our basis for understanding risk assessment, but it also gives us our rationale for treating risks. So if we can identify these contaminant linkages, these source pathway receptor linkages, if we can estimate them so we can focus on the ones that are significant and important, we can also then determine how best to treat them. And the treatment could be at the level of the source, for example, some kind of extraction. We call that source management. It could be at the level of the pathway, for example, a plume management, or like monitored natural attenuation. We call that pathway management. Or it could be an intervention at the level of the receptor, for example, an institutional control. And a very common example of an institutional control is a planning condition on a site. So, for example, a site is remediated so it's suitable for industrial use or for use for housing without gardens, or for use for housing with gardens, and we might set different levels of acceptable contaminant thresholds depending on the type of use, because we know the type of use is an institutional control on the exposure of the receptor. So land contamination is predicated on the basis of risk-based management. But what else do we need? Well, from the context of sustainable remediation, we really need to show an overall net benefit. And the little table you can see on the bottom left there, I'll come back to. But these sets out a series of overarching categories of impacts, for example, in the environment to air, water, and soil, for social to human health and safety, community involvement, neighborhoods and locality, and a series of economic impacts as described in the little animation. The other thing that we need is good practice. So we need to be ensuring that there's protection of human health and the environment and other key receptors. That includes safe working practices. We need to be able to demonstrate that we have consistent, clear, and reproducible approaches to how we take our decisions for managing sites. And we need to record what we're doing in a way that's transparent. And we have to include the assumptions that we make, and there may be unconscious assumptions, so we have to be careful to test what we're saying so that we can be clear what assumptions are underpinning our decisions, and we have to be clear about what uncertainties there might be. We need sound principles of governance. So this governance means the regulatory and policy framework in which decisions are made for contaminated sites. And increasingly, we need to show that we've got a suitable level of stakeholder involvement in the decisions. And last but by no means least, our evidence has to be based on sound science. Coming back to this question about stakeholders and governance, we need to have engagement for several reasons. Firstly, so that our decisions are transparent and not questioned in the long term. So that if we're making assessments, for example, of sustainability or risks, they're robust and they've been tested by different groups of people who are interested. And in the long run, engagement also helps us reduce a number of project challenges. We're not going to be faced by a particular group of stakeholders putting a spanner in the works because they haven't been properly consulted, for instance. And something else that is critical, and this underpins a lot of thinking from the Nicole network on contaminated land management in Europe, or the new approaches to sustainable remediation in the USA, is this idea of stewardship, that we need to be considering our outcomes in the long term, and we need resilient solutions that are robust to the challenges of climate change and financial uncertainty that we might face in the future. So there are a number of benefits in this concept of sustainable and risk-based land management. There are three key benefits to basing our decisions on risk assessment. It provides us our most objective understanding of likely harm, so we can document who or what will be affected, how they might be affected, and why, and how urgent the problem is. It provides us this methodological framework that I described to be able to properly engineer remediation solutions and understand where is the most optimal place for us to deliver some kind of an intervention. And it also allows us to prioritize our resources to the most significant and urgent problems, i.e. the ones posing the greatest risks. If we add sustainability to the mix, then that allows us to look at optimizing the risk management process itself. For example, picking solutions that reduce secondary environmental impacts, for instance, or other kinds of secondary impacts, for instance, dust or noise or traffic. It allows us to maximize the benefit and value that we might have for the remediation project, which leads to better cost effectiveness overall. It allows us to understand where there might be wider project risks and what we can do to avoid them. It allows us to link our work to the UN Sustainable Development Goals and various other government or corporate policies that might be important for the site in terms of sustainable development. And finally, it has a very positive impact on reputation, on brand value and public relations. So those are the benefits. And it's a global interest. So the map here, different colors of green, are the regions and countries that are now working on sustainable remediation. And since I drew that map, a Sustainable Remediation Forum network has just launched in France. This is all open. There's a link here on the slides where you can find out more. So for example, if the geological and geotechnical societies in Portugal wanted to take an initiative on sustainable remediation, there's this international alliance who would be delighted to help them and delighted to be open to them. So coming now to the technical segments of the talk, I think there are 5 broad triggers for deciding that something needs to be done for a site. The first of these is regulatory demand. Now, this might be a direct demand by the regulator because there is a perceived impact from the site that the regulator thinks is serious enough to warrant some kind of intervention straight away. It might come about as what's called a voluntary remediation. So this is where a site owner suspects that his site has got a serious level of contamination. So they take preemptive action so they can manage their problems before the regulator insists that they manage their problems. And there are a number of advantages to doing that, not least being in control of the situation a little bit more. And regulatory demand might also arise in some countries where they're inventorying their suspected and potential contaminated sites. And many countries are doing that, many countries are not doing that. So for example, the of reviewing which sites are potentially contaminated and deciding amongst those which are the most serious ones that demand the most urgent attention. And the Netherlands is the furthest along that path. So the Netherlands has long since completed its inventorying process, and I think all of its serious and urgent cases have now been remediated. The most common trigger in all of these countries, all countries, including the Netherlands, is because there's a change of land use. So change of land use means that, for example, a site is going to be reused or redeveloped for a purpose like housing or a commercial purpose, and that then triggers the Spatial Planning Authority to consider what aspects might be important in that land reuse. And in a country like the UK, for example, land contamination is a material consideration that the planning authority has to take into account. So in the UK, for contaminated land, contaminated sites management, should I say, about 90% of the planning or regulatory decisions for site management in the UK come through this change of land use, and only about 10% from regulatory demand. Something related to that is in economic triggers. So this is where there are mergers and acquisitions between companies, and then in the merger and acquisition process, there'll be negotiations about contaminated sites. So companies need to understand their land holdings and manage their liabilities. In some cases, it might be a site where there has been a previous remediation that has not worked, so there needs to be a repair. And in some cases, contamination is a result of crime. Very commonly in the USA, even countries like New Zealand, land contamination is connected to crime from the criminal preparation of narcotics. There are also triggers from other domains. So the EU Water Framework Directive has requirements on ecological quality for surface water and groundwater, and that may demand that contaminated sites are managed because there's a downstream impact on water quality. And of course, there's the Industrial Emissions Directive that manages spills or uncontrolled emissions from operating permitted processes. This is the old way of stakeholder engagement when we're looking at a planning decision. So this is a nice little cartoon. It's the local authority planning committee. They've passed the planning decision. Now they only have to do the draft consultation document and everything will be finished. But wait, what about the stakeholders? Why weren't they considered early on? So why should you consider stakeholders? Well, here are some example reasons. It may be obligatory. So under the policy regime, there may be some stakeholders that you have to consult with, very commonly the planning authority and the regulator. It may be important that you make consultation with local communities to make sure that the project is accepted. So no one's going to lie down on the road in front of your diggers because they're objecting to your project. You might need to consult to better understand the risk management requirements for the site. So different people might have different knowledge. Related to that, for carrying out assessments, particularly where you're looking for historical information. In some cases, particularly where there's going to be a public use of the site, for example, as a green space, then clearly there needs to be widespread stakeholder engagement, including with public interest groups. And of course, you may need to be engaging with people to raise funds. It's very usual for consultants and site owners, particularly on smaller sites, to think about engagement as a bit of a nuisance. It's time consuming, you lose control of your project, And not only is the process itself costly, but it might cost you money to deal with some of the concerns that people raise. The flip side of that is that the consultation you do can be scalable. You don't have to consult everyone in one go, so it can be iterative. And it can be done in a way that is facilitative. So think about what you need to know to make the project run more smoothly, so that you save time and money in the long run. And very often, then you might divide the engagement into 3 kind of broad zones. There may be organizations who are at the core of the decision-making process. Site owner, the technical advisors and consultants, the contractor, the regulator, the planner. There may be other stakeholders that you need to be in dialogue with, in two-way conversation with. For instance, people on neighboring sites, or people who have a specific technical input to the project, health and safety advisors, for instance. And then you may also have a wider audience who you're not necessarily going to have a dialogue with, but you want to promote your project to or describe what you've done. So this is very much a whistle-stop tour of the different parts of sustainable and risk-based land management. And there's a longer treatment for each section, of course, within the book. But I would have to say that, wouldn't I? So underpinning good contaminated sites management practice is this idea of the conceptual site model. And there are different international standards for this. For example, there's an ISO standard on a conceptual site model. It's a very simple idea. Some kind of a diagrammatic representation of the key features of the site, describing these contaminant linkages, these source pathway receptor linkages, and supporting those diagrams with some clear descriptive text. And this conceptual site model is developed iteratively. So you might begin with something that's rather simple and approximate at the first stages of site investigation. If then your potentially contaminated site turns out to be one that needs further investigation, then you advance the site conceptual model based on that. You might advance it further as you're looking at your different options for remediation and then planning the remediation, carrying out the remediation, verifying that the remediation has worked. This is almost easily done on the basis of having some sound conceptual understanding of the site that you summarize in this kind of a diagram. Very simple diagram. So here's a very simple diagram showing one contaminant linkage and some of the key features of a site. And the usual way this is drawn up is that there will be a cross-sectional view of the site. So you can see that on the left, and the plan view of the site. You show the key features in the site, for example, the nature of the subsurface, where the water table is, where there are aquifers. You show where the sources are. So in this case, they're drawn in red, the pathways in green, and the receptors in yellow on this particular diagram. And you support that with some brief text, key data, the linkages and their significance, a bit more detail on the ground conditions, a sustainability assessment, maybe a remediation options appraisal table. These might all come into the conceptual model as you develop it across those different stages of site management that I listed before. So the first step in building this site model, and the first step in contaminated sites management in general, is of course the site investigation. And in very approximate terms, we tend to distinguish 2 broad phases: an initial and a preliminary site investigation, and then something that's more detailed. So the goal of your initial investigation is to review what the potential contaminative uses of that site were in the past. So what sorts of use of site might have happened, for example, solvent storage, dry cleaning, mining, metalworking, whatever it is. Those are usually associated with different types of contamination. You might be looking at the site to see if there are any qualitative indicators of contamination, tanks or tar ponds. And this is generally done on the basis of document searches and review. In many places, documents for doing this are now available online. Typically, you'd make a site visit, walkover survey. You would potentially take some field tools with you, like portable X-ray fluorescence, something like that. And the goal is to make a qualitative risk assessment. By that, I mean a list of the possible source pathway receptor linkages on that site that could give rise to risks to key receptors, humans, ecology, water bodies, for example. And you use this really to make your first initial conceptual site model. Now, it could be that when you estimate these risks, you find that none of them are really significant. So the initial preliminary walkover information might confirm an opinion that this suspected site is actually not potentially contaminated. The flip side is that you might find some of these linkages could be significant, in which case then you have to go to a more detailed site investigation to address your gaps in knowledge. So this is the site investigation work where you're perhaps putting wells in the ground, digging trial pits and taking samples, sending them for off-site analyses, making more detailed on-site surveys, looking in more detail at the ground conditions, the geology, hydrogeology, hydrology of the site, to make a more detailed conceptual site model. And at this point, usually your risk assessment is now moving to a quantitative basis where you've got measured values of contaminants in water or soil, and you're comparing those to threshold concentrations to decide if you need to do further risk assessment or remediation. If that is the case, then you may well end up also doing some supplementary investigations, for example, because you found a hotspot that you need to better delineate, or maybe to support choices of different remediation solutions. Site remediation has to deal with a lot of complexity. So this little diagram is actually based on a site I visited. There's a pesticide warehouse on a concrete hard standing. So the initial idea was probably that they just had to deal with the contamination that was on the surface of the concrete and in the pesticide warehouse. Actually, underneath the concrete hard standing, well, there was waste used as an infill. Nobody knew what was in that waste. Made ground from various sources containing asbestos. And there was a previous manufacturing that had gone on that site. And for example, leakages from buried tanks, where there was movement of the tank contents via gas and water phases. And this is only in the Bardos zone. I haven't even got to the aquifers yet. So you have a layered use on sites often over time. And many of our contaminated sites have been there for decades. So the sites themselves are quite complex. And this poses us a number of challenges. And these are just some examples. Now, this is pretty much a skip over. So there's some words in here that I need to explain as we go along. When we're making samples, designing a sampling strategy for a contaminated site, there are two broad approaches that we can take to sampling. One is called systematic sampling. This is where you're taking your samples across points of a grid, and you take it at that grid point, whatever. The other approach is judgmental sampling. So in judgmental sampling, maybe you have some previous maps of the site, so you understand where contamination is more likely to be, so you focus your sampling on the basis of that understanding. Judgmental sampling is obviously highly functional, but when it comes to making comparisons with threshold values, then it has a systematic bias. You've biased your sampling rather than taken a random approach. A big challenge then, even if you've got systematic sampling and you're making your comparison against threshold values, is that the data on contaminated sites that we have is typically limited, and it's usually not normally distributed. So I've seen bunches of site investigations where people have got some data, they've done their 95% confidence limits, they've compared that with some numbers that they've got out of a book somewhere for threshold values, and they say, well, it's outside the confidence limit, so we're good, it's not contaminated. Well, it's completely farcical conclusion, because they haven't done any kind of test of normality of the data, so they don't know whether it's normally distributed or whether the distribution is skewed, so the whole comparison may not be valid. Another common challenge on sites is that people might use composite soil samples because they want to cut the cost of the analyses. So what they think to themselves is, well, if I take a shovel full of soil from these 6 locations and mix them together, then it's kind of like a sample of these 6 locations. Well, that rather depends on how well you can mix it. Bear in mind that the volume of solid material that might actually go forward for analytical preparation will be in the order of grams, and you're trying to mix shovelfuls of quite complex materials that are kilograms in size. So composite soil solid samples is usually a pretty unreliable approach. Another challenge might be related to sample management, of course, and documenting it, and quality control. A very successful remediation treatment for volatile organic compounds is usually excavation, because it all goes into the atmosphere. So by the time you take the sample for analysis and you take it to the lab, it's already got low levels of VOC. Why? Because you actually lost it from the sample in the first place. So what strategies can we use in response to these challenges? Well, critically, it's identifying what the uncertainties are and being clear about these to the different stakeholders and managing their expectations and not overclaiming what your data can actually show. It's usually also useful to take an iterative approach. So be aware that you might have to go back to get better information, and in particular, integrating more rapid field tests, which you can afford to do more of, with off-site analytical measurements to kind of benchmark them. And this is the basis of a sampling approach that the US EPA calls triad, for instance. So when you're talking to the stakeholders about your site investigation, then if you're clear on the purpose for your activity, then that gives you a reason for explaining why you might be taking a particular sampling strategy. So if your strategy is to delineate, to identify the areas of most contamination, your hotspots, then probably judgmental sampling on the basis of the existing information, like plans or whatever you have on the site, is likely to be a good way forward. If you're making a comparison, trying to do some sort of statistical test against regulatory thresholds, then you can't base that on a judgmental approach. Or can you? Well, if you think about using zoning, then you can. What do I mean by zoning? Well, for example, if you use judgmental sampling to delineate a hotspot, then within that hotspot, you would take samples across a grid and use those grid samples for your comparison against the threshold. There are lots of other purposes and strategies, but I better move on to risk assessment. This is really a whistle-stop tour of contaminated sites management. I do apologize. Risk assessment usually follows a tiered approach. And very commonly, there are 3 tiers that are distinguished. The first is this preliminary, oh, I can't say the word, preliminary, give up on it, initial qualitative risk assessment, which is desk-based, visit-based, walkover studies. And this is where you're identifying your pollutant or contaminant linkages and their likelihood and potential for harm. Where the linkages appear likely and have a likely potential for harm, then the second tier is a quantitative risk assessment. And there are 2 flavors of quantitative risk assessment. The most common approach is to use generic risk assessment. So here you're looking at samples of soil and water and their analytical values and comparing them against generic criteria that have been published that are indicative of whether or not further action is needed. These generic criteria have to be fairly conservative because they have to be suitable for a wide range of contaminated sites because they could be used anywhere. So in some cases, particularly for more complex sites, the consultant might make their own detailed quantitative risk assessment where they apply the regulatory models that are used in the risk assessment, but they apply it to site-specific data to come up with a site-specific number rather than using something that's a generic reference. So at the qualitative level, I mentioned risk estimation, and a very common approach to risk estimation is to consider it on the basis of a risk matrix. So in shorthand, risk is a function of the likely impact or level of harm versus the likelihood that that harm might take place. So what a practitioner will often do is define a risk matrix, and they'll say something like, well, low likelihood of harm, low impact, then we'll say that's a low risk. And then there will be a high impact and a high likelihood of harm, that would be a high risk. So they make a traffic light system, and this is a cube of, sorry, a rectangle of 9 cells, but you can cut this in different ways. The main idea behind it is to have a rationale for how you're estimating your risks qualitatively and at what level you might then sign off the site as not needing further investigation. So for example, you would say, look, on this site, we've identified all of the potential contaminant linkages and they all come up with low risk. Therefore, we're going to say this site is no longer suspected as a contaminated site. Another site might trigger a few of these medium squares or even some of the high risk squares, and that might then suggest that you need to go to a detailed site investigation and a quantitative risk assessment. As I mentioned before, the quantitative risk assessment is almost invariably based on a comparison of your site analytical data with calculated thresholds for some sort of acceptable maximum concentration of a substance in soil or water. There's some degree of difficulty in making the comparison. So, and this is why you need clear engagement with the different stakeholders that all of the stakeholders agree upon. Are you going to fail that zone of a site if any sample exceeds the published threshold? Or will you use a mean or a confidence interval? Do you know what the uncertainties are of the data that you're trying to make the comparison? Do you know if it's normally distributed so a confidence interval is even appropriate? So often you might not have full answers to those questions, so you have to agree a comparison with the different stakeholders that you can all agree on is likely to be safest for that particular site. The way that these calculated thresholds are derived is usually based on maximum intake from a site versus the likely intake from that site per unit, whatever kilogram of soil or water. So the maximum intake would be based on the toxicological understanding of the substance, what is decided as an acceptable level of risk, so 1 in a million excess cancer risk, and also taking into account what that receptor, in this case human health, might be taking up from other sources. So for example, if this was an estimate for cadmium, then in Japan or China, for instance, then you might be interested to know how much cadmium people are taking up from the rice that they eat, which tends to contain a little bit of cadmium. Because obviously, if they're already taking some cadmium into their system, the amount that's acceptable from the site has to be less. In terms of the likely intake from the site, well, that depends on the particular source pathway receptors that are taking place on that site. So the distribution and behavior of the receptors on that site and the models of exposure from different pathways. So that will be a function of the physical and chemical characteristics of the ground, the biological behavior of your different receptors, and the way in which they're exposed through different pathways from the end use of the site, for example, through air or through water. And these conceptual models for the basis of these published thresholds are usually very generic because they have to apply to a wide number of sites. So for example, industrial land might be one generic basis for a model, or houses with gardens or houses without gardens. They won't be very specific. And the combination of this knowledge of what the likely uptake is from a particular site configuration and what is the maximum tolerable intake from a site allows the calculation of this threshold value. And if you're looking to make a site-specific value, then obviously the top row isn't going to change. It's the bottom row that might vary from site to site. So how do we manage these risks? Well, as a brief recap, we can manage it at the level of the source, the pathway, or the receptor. Things are slightly different for diffuse contamination because in this case, it can be hard to distinguish the source from the pathway. So to all intents and purposes, the source and the pathway treatment are inextricably mixed, at least for soil. Sorry, that was very quick. So if you want to ask questions on the risk management or any questions as we go along, feel free. There is somebody picking up the questions as we go along, and they will then ask me those questions on your behalf at the end of the talk, and I'll see if I can answer them. There are several ways in which we might remediate a site. In some cases, we might be looking at a treatment-based application. That could be an application that goes on an excavated material or pumped water, we call that ex situ, or it might be the material is still within the subsurface when we call it in situ. We could apply civil engineering based approaches, which is I guess where we began with remediation work in the 1970s and 1980s, excavation and removal, or we can go to treatment-based approaches. And the treatment-based approaches, well, we can describe these in different ways, but basically we're talking about the treatment of contaminants in the matrix, be it soil or water, using different interventions, biological, chemical, physical, or combined interventions like solidification, stabilization, or thermal treatments. And coming back to the risk management, at least for point sources in this example, there are different modalities really for our treatments. So for source management, the kinds of treatments we might apply could be removal of some kind, which could be an excavation and disposal, excavation and treatment off-site in some ex situ process, or on-site in some ex situ process. We also have some in situ options, for example, extraction treatments like dual phase extraction, in situ treatments that destroy contaminants like chemox, or some that stabilize contaminants in situ. We've got a slightly larger menu of options when we're managing pathways. Removal through excavation is actually relatively uncommon for pathway management, because by the time the contaminant's in the pathway, there's a large amount of materials to be removed if it's solid. I guess it's common if we consider pump and treat as removal. And then there are a whole range of different in situ approaches that we might apply, including extraction treatments, destruction treatments, stabilization, containment, PRBs, and monitored natural attenuation. And there's a broad, and the book goes through each one of these in detail, a broad range then of these techniques. So here are the different modalities, and then these are the tools that we can put into those modalities. The book itself gives a kind of high-level operating window for each of these techniques, telling you what it does, what it's all about, what the treatable problems are, and how you implement them. Something to bear in mind as we look at this is that it can be very useful to take an integrated approach to our site remediation. So I've mentioned that there might be intervention at the source, there might be intervention at the pathway, there might be intervention at the receptor, but in fact, particularly in early stages of a project, all three might be going on at the same time. So for example, in this diagram, there might be some dual phase extraction to remove the benzene, toluene, ethyl xylene, and xylene. Sorry, ethyl toluene and xylene. Start again. I do apologize. Benzene, toluene, ethyl benzene, and xylene. That's BTEX. It's a non-aqueous phase liquid, and it's volatile. So you could employ things like dual phase extraction to remove some of the source term. It won't remove it all. So perhaps you implement a monitored natural attenuation strategy to deal with what's already in the plume and anything that's residual in the ground that's moving into the plume. So that's your pathway management. And in the short term, perhaps you have a temporary institutional control, limiting the use of water from that groundwater well until the monitoring shows that the plume has dissipated. Another strategy, which is often is called gentle remediation. We tending to call this nature-based systems now, and these are typically plant-based or in situ stabilization agent-based, like biochar, where we remediate soils using phytoremediation and other low-cost approaches, And the idea of this is to reduce the environmental impacts of the remediation process itself on the environment. Very quickly on implementation, just to bear in mind that there are 5 key stages. There's the option appraisal. There's a stage that I've really helpfully called here implementation, by which I mean that's actually the delivery of the remediation. There's the verification that you have reached your risk management goals. Typically, you may need to monitor in the long term. There may need to be some element of aftercare and stewardship for the site. And there may also be opportunities at those different stages to improve recycling and reuse. The last main segment of this talk is about sustainable remediation, and you saw the little video at the beginning. This is a very simple framework for sustainable remediation, just showing these different stages of decision making. So on the right hand side, you have what Surf UK calls stage B, and this is where the risk management goals have been set, and we're making a choice between technologies, say excavation and removal to landfill, or excavation and a biopile, ex situ bioremediation. And we use sustainability assessment basically to help us choose which is likely to be the most sustainable means of delivering those risk management goals. However, if you look at sustainability earlier on in the planning of the site, which we call stage A, you may get a bigger sustainability gain because you might find, for example, that by changing the land use or changing what soils need to be moved, you can actually avoid some remedial actions because you've changed the risk profile of the reuse of that site. There are other kinds of ways in which you might get greater sustainability gain at the planning stage. For example, if you're looking at several sites in parallel, you might find that there's synergies by arranging a co-treatment of those sites at the same time. In terms of sustainability, this is the little chart that I showed you earlier on. Again, this comes from Surf UK. There are a range of different considerations in sustainability. Sustainability is generally divided into 3 broad elements: environmental element, a social element, and an economic element. And Surf UK has further divided those into 5 broad categories in each element. So, for example, emissions to air, soil and ground conditions, impacts on groundwater and surface water, ecology, natural resources, and waste for the environment segment. I'm not going to go through this whole table, but I'll pick out 3 examples. So, remediation practitioner may say to themselves, well, what is ethics and equity to do with the choice of remediation solution? Well, there are a number of ways in which it's related, but one very important way is in whether or not we're choosing options that are dealing with a problem now, or whether we're passing them on to future generations. So that's an example of ethics and equity consideration. Uncertainty in evidence. This is describing that different remediation options come with different levels of knowledge. So some may be more uncertain and have a poorer evidence base than others. I'll pick one from the economics now. Mostly they're fairly straightforward, but one that is less straightforward is this one called induced economic costs and benefits. So if you think about the direct costs and benefits as being the primary sort of economic figure, then there might be very obvious secondary ones in terms of indirect economic costs and benefits, like uplift of surrounding property values or improvement in employment levels. This induced one is like a tertiary economic impact. So, for instance, you've treated a site, and that makes the area more attractive for inward investment for other purposes. Or you've treated the site using an innovative approach, and that improves know-how and skills and economic performance in the sector. So those are some examples. I'm sorry I'm lasering through this, and I'm still taking far too long to finish this talk. This diagram is basically summarizing that there are different ways in which you might carry out the assessment. And what SURF UK recommends is that you start simple. So you start with a qualitative sustainability assessment. And in 80–90% of cases, that's probably all you need to do. Because you want to spend obviously the least money that you have to on the sustainability assessment. You might go to a semi-quantitative approach. This is a multi-criteria analysis with scores and weightings. And for very complex sites, you might need to make a quantitative cost-benefit assessment. You probably heard of something called green remediation. Green remediation is a concept that was developed by the US Environmental Protection Agency for their Superfund sites. Its focus is a little bit different to sustainable remediation. So in the Superfund, the sites that have been decided on have already had some social and economic assessment. So the decision they are wanting to look at is what is the most environmentally acceptable approach. So they're focusing just on the environmental element of remediation, and they're focusing at the level that the risk assessment decisions have already been made. But interestingly, you can see that there's a very close alignment between the environmental element of the SURF UK indicators and the best management practices for green remediation as specified by the US EPA. So there's some parallel evolution there. So I'm actually going to conclude at this point, Celeste. I'm not going to go to the table and diagrams because I think we've used enough time. My conclusion really is a question. What is appropriate contaminated site management? Well, going through the segments of this talk, I think it's important to recognize that triggers have an impact. So they affect the urgency and timeline of the site. So it could be that the remediation has to go on very urgently for an environmental reason, or it could be an economic reason. So Aldi's bought the site and they need to get the supermarket on there in 6 months, and that immediately puts boundaries on what kinds of remediation are possible. The contaminated site management must achieve its risk management goals. That's an absolute bottom line. If the remediation is not managing risks, then it's non-functional. And when you manage the risks, then you need to understand the technical suitability of the remedial approach for dealing with those risks, and also something called, which I've called feasibility, which isn't a very good distinguishing, because suitability and feasibility basically mean the same thing. But what I'm trying to explain here is that you might have some technically suitable options, but they may not necessarily be feasible because, for example, they're considered to be emerging, or that there's some doubt about the person who's putting them forward, or they might not be available, or they might not be properly licensed. So then they can't be offered for that site in a way that's confident. Obviously, sustainability and finding an approach that's broadly acceptable to the key stakeholder interests for the site, and ensuring that those stakeholders have been properly engaged with. And clearly cost effectiveness. But this needs to look at the overall value of the site as well as the narrow terms of the remediation project cost and the value rise of the site, there might be a range of other wider benefits and wider costs that need to be properly considered. There are a number of resources that I've got here for this slide deck, which you can access, where most of the information here is free to view, although the ISO you have to pay for, and probably you have to pay for the special issue as well. There are multiple other resources, and if you need more information about the book, which has about 600 citations in it, then please don't hesitate to drop me a line. I'll close with this slide. This is all available for free from claire.co.uk/surfuk. Thanks very much. Over to you, Celeste. Sorry I took so long.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you very much. It was very good. And I would like to, this is a very complex subject, and it's not easy sometimes to make understandable the concept of sustainable remediation based on risk to several mentalities and in this kind of subject. And I would like to ask to pose several questions by my idea. And for example, I saw the risk matrix, and for the Portuguese at this moment, the risk matrix is a thing that everyone knows what is a risk matrix, because for COVID communication, the information that are available all days, and we are seeing the information be presented by the risk matrix. And everyone knows who is a risk matrix, and this is very good to understand what kind of can be the risk can be communicated in this situation of soil contamination. The context is different, but the communication of the information is made by this way. And for you, I know that you work with sustainable remediation since a long time, and China has a lot of contaminated sites, and it was, for me, it was a good surprise to know that China is already adopt this kind of approach, and you have a lot of experience. Do you like to speak about more precisely in the subject of China?
That's a pretty huge question. There's a huge amount of remediation research and development going on in China, and a huge amount of remediation activity. They published their policy of 10 points, they call it, on contaminated sites management in 2016. And in 2019, they published their law on soil pollution. And both of those, and I can send you the links if you remind me, Celeste, are available in English on their website. Their approach is risk-based. So what China has done is to be taking a very close view of other countries. So they've had collaborations with the USA, with the UK. There's a China-EU soil group that's been meeting, and they've basically taken a very close view about what's been happening elsewhere, and they've certainly taken a lot of those points on board. Some things are different in China. In China, a real driver of concern for them is agricultural land contamination. So whereas policies here in Europe tend to be a bit different, so there's an agricultural soils policy, and then there's a soils management in urban areas. So my talk's largely been about the urban context. In China, there's much more focus on agricultural land contamination than in Europe. Most of the remediation that's happening in China follows these national guidelines, but is regulated on a regional or city basis. And there's some learning that some of the stakeholders still need to do because everything is a bit new. So something that is of great interest in China is case studies of risk management, case studies of secondary impacts, which I'll come back to, and case studies of what they call green and sustainable remediation. So China has a clear interest in green and sustainable remediation. They use that term, which follows on the term that's been sort of invented in the States. So in the States, the US EPA had green remediation. The States had the first sustainable remediation forum, and their focus was on sustainable remediation. And there were many arguments over many years over which was best. So their standards body and then another body came up with this idea of green and sustainable remediation, which tries to marry the two ideas together. So this is the same kind of approach that China has, and China has a number of sustainable remediation development projects. They're developing their tools and their guidance now, in a big project being funded by their Ministry of Science and Technology. Of particular concern in China is that where remediation is happening, it's usually happening because it's been driven by the property market, and land values in China are often very high. So there's been a lot of remediation in cities like Beijing and Shanghai, for instance, and that usually tends to be thermal. It's thermal because everybody agrees that it deals with the contamination, and it's either in situ thermal or ex situ thermal. So the regulators in China would like to have encourage their market to take a wider focus, because the secondary emissions of this, in terms of emissions to air, in terms of carbon intensity, in terms of road traffic, and nuisance, for instance, are quite high. So the drive in China is towards mitigating these secondary emissions, and their leader recently has put carbon at the top of their agenda. So probably carbon footprint is going to be a driver for their remediation selection. It's a bit long-winded, but that's about my understanding of where things are in China at the moment.
Okay. One thing you spoke about green and sustainable remediation. I think both are connected, and I like the green, because I assume that sustainable remediation is green more something else, and it's wonderful, and connecting these both concepts, green and sustainable, how do you put the natural based solution in this context? How do you referred to I wrote this gentle remediation options. Is more or less natural based solution? Is
I think so. Gentle remediation options came out of people who are interested in phytoremediation and biochar, and things like that.
Okay.
And I think that nature-based solutions is a wider term that kind of absorbs it.
Yeah.
So nature-based is probably all about putting the entire ecosystem onto the site, and you returning to the site both a remediation benefit and also a benefit of wider functionalities for green infrastructure, feedstocks, or whatever. So that's how I see nature-based solutions as a bigger term. In the UK, we don't see the need for the word green remediation because we think it's already an intrinsic part of sustainable remediation. But in America, because of their policy context, then they've had to invent a combined term. And I think then there are language issues too, so that for some countries, they simply prefer to call it green and sustainable remediation because that makes more sense to them. Because as you know, each country has its own flavor of English. So I think, yeah, there are countries in Europe which have an emphasis more on the environmental element of sustainability. So Belgium, for instance, tends to focus, Flanders in Belgium tends to focus more on the environmental element of sustainability. But they do have an interest as well in the economic and social elements.
Other questions I would like to know, and other persons. Do you think that the sustainable remediation can be less expensive than the common approach of remediation? Because all the social, economic, and environmental.
That's a really interesting question. So part of the reason for the big argument between the US EPA and the SURF in the States to begin with is that the US EPA felt that sustainable remediation was a kind of an excuse to have a lower quality of risk management, so that you would use the other elements of sustainability to argue that you don't do as much risk management because of the wider sustainability impacts. So they saw it, the EPA saw it as a way of getting cheap remediation in under the radar. And this was a suspicion, I think, that was quite widely shared in the regulatory community, even in Europe, to begin with. But I think now there's a much more nuanced opinion that everybody agrees with, which is that if you're not managing the risks, there's no point doing the remediation. So the remediation has to manage the risks. And what we're seeking to do with the sustainable bit is to optimize that process and maximize its value. So to come to the question of costs, I think that's very difficult to call. There's no reason why it should be more expensive, but it's not necessarily going to be cheaper either in the short term. But what it should achieve is a better solution in the long term. So probably the cost benefit equation is better. Is that, I don't know how complete an answer that is.
No, yes, you answered. Other thing that it's important is that we know that sustainable remediation will be the present now already and the future, because this is a reality. And do you think that most of the countries are going to follow this kind of approach?
I guess in Europe that depends a lot on how they change the soil strategy and what happens with the Green Deal. But you can see in the Horizon Europe calls the very strong emphasis on nature-based systems and sustainable approaches, which is in the call texts. I don't know. I don't know if it's fully understood. The main stakeholder networks in Europe, which is Nicole and the Common Forum, they're all pushing for this idea of sustainable and risk-based remediation. So there's a shared purpose between the regulators, the service providers, and the site owners. So I think the direction of travel is towards sustainable remediation. I think the main challenge at the moment is that not all of the stakeholders have got enough knowledge to be able to implement it properly.
I know that the update of 2006 EU soil thematic strategy is now about new soil strategy, healthy soil for a healthy life. The sustainable remediation is already there?
I think so, and I can't remember the name of it, but there was a new UN and FAO document that came out last month. Again, remind me, I'll send you the link.
Okay.
That has a focus on sustainability.
Okay.
But I think the main driver for this is the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And this is one of the reasons that SURF UK has mapped all of its work to the SDGs, because if we can show how we are supporting the development of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, then we should be in line with government and corporate policy.
We received questions about site investigation and the process of prospection and the way that samples are collected. And I would like to ask you, compared the regular prospection process and the high resolution site investigation, for this kind of approach, what are the one that you prefer?
Please repeat.
I think that for site investigation, first step, for example, first stage or first step, and you are the traditional process of prospection, the collection of sample in depth, the normal one, like to drill, to hole, to drill and collect the sample, and the one that use the high resolution site investigation, the one that you receive the information in real time. You are going to there are tools for that kind of, in Europe is not so used like in the USA.
You mean like a membrane interface?
Yes,
probe?
like membrane, MEOP, yeah, exactly, membrane, things like that, yeah.
So typically the phase one, which is just the desk study and the walkover, people don't spend a lot of money on that. Might be you know, several thousand euros, and that will be looking at the existing documentation, looking at the historic maps, historic permits, doing a walkover to look for visible signs or olfactory signs. And maybe some consultancies will take a handheld, or if they're existing groundwater wells, they might put a probe down there. But the idea of this is really just to see if there really are potential contaminant linkages. I think then when you're coming to the detailed investigation of the site and understanding the pollutant linkages within the site conceptual model, this is when these real-time tools become extremely useful. They're very useful for designing your remediation approach, for delineating where the pollutants are, where they're going, where there's, say, distributed in an aquifer. And obviously they can create a lot of data for a relatively small investment. They're not so good where you are having to comply with strict soil threshold or water threshold values, because they'll always require some analytical data. It really depends on the regulator. But for instance, if you were trying to show to the regulator that you were managing a pathway and that you were proving that there was monitored natural attenuation going on, or you were proving that your in situ bioremediation was working, then these real-time tools become very important. But it's the final sign-off, what the regulator is going to accept before they say, well, this cleanup's completed. I think that often tends to be still related to lab data. I don't know, what's your opinion?
Sometimes I like several tools that answer on the field, that can give a semi-quantitative results, to have an idea what a semi-quantitative or qualitative, even quantitative result to follow, to allow us to make a decision. And this is important, and to help us to construct the conceptual site model in several steps during the process. And I know in Europe, I don't know a lot about the use of this kind of high resolution tools, and prefer the prospection, the collection, to dig, to do a hole and collect a sample and something like this. But sometimes I like to have an idea in precise time and of the quantity, semi-quantitative or even quantitative data of the situation of the area, of the quantity of contaminants and things like that. For the conceptual site model, sometimes it's very important to improve the knowledge, because it's a very interactive way, it's a process. This is very interactive. I know that sometimes to wait for an answer from the lab, and it takes a long time. And if you can have an answer, a correct answer in the real time, it's easier to understand the way that the site is at this precise moment. I don't know, what do you think?
Well, I agree with you. I think in terms of the engineering and the delivery of your system and verifying that it's working, these tools are extremely useful.
Yes, I agree with you. Uncertainty is a certainty that we have in this kind of studies. How do you deal with uncertainty in all this process?
I think that's almost you can't eliminate uncertainty. You have to decide with the other stakeholders what level of uncertainty you're prepared to live with. And I think it's a fact of life that usually you cannot afford to pay for the certainty that you would like. So there are various statistical tools for looking at uncertainty and for maximizing the value of your data. I think that's a rather specialist area. It's not one that I would feel comfortable to comment on. What I would say is it comes down to a discussion between the stakeholders for the site about what they can afford and what they can live with, and they need to be transparent in documenting what they decide. But I don't think there's any there's any silver bullet for that.
Yeah.
It's just important, if you've only got limited resources, to avoid wasting your time on doing things that are simply not going to work, like composite samples, or failing to even understand whether your data is normally distributed or whether it can be transformed to a normal distribution.
Okay. I have one question here. It was sent by chat. I don't know if I can understand very well. It was sent by Luana and Nicole. Nicole, it was a person, not the network. If you, sir, have any information about the public management model of, for example, of a zone with some sites contaminated with, for example, VOCs, vapor extraction dissolved plume, and that the solution was conjugated in a consortium approach integrating companies and governments for the fuel area instead of the site-by-site approach. Did you understand the meaning?
Is it maybe more of a comment than a question?
It was a question mark. Wouldn't that be more resonant for a sustainable remediation solution?
Okay, I think I understand that if I'm understanding the question correctly, and I'm going to state it probably a lot more simply, maybe too simply, that there can be greater sustainability if you manage a number of sites at the same time. So, for example, if you have was it a groundwater plume that was being discussed running across several sites, then it makes sense to manage all of those sites at the same time.
Oh, okay.
Was that
maybe
question?
With some sites contaminated with, okay, maybe a plume that cross underground
usually, for whatever reason, it can be more sustainable to manage a portfolio of sites in parallel. So, for example, you could have a treatment hub that supports a cluster of sites, so that you don't have to mobilize your treatment, say it's a soil washing or something, onto lots of different sites. You can bring the materials to one site and take them back, providing the regulator agrees. It's actually quite difficult from a policy perspective because of the way the Waste Framework Directive is written, but that's a whole other subject. Or there might be other kinds of gains by treating sites together in an area. Where sites are impacted by a plume, I think that becomes quite a complicated discussion between the owners of a site. So the first question is, where's the origin of the plume or the plumes? Where's the source term? And it might be that the best liability management that you will have will be to manage the aquifer downstream on your perimeter. If you can't control what's upstream, if you have sources on the site. But I think it becomes a really complicated discussion, and then you get into this question of environmental forensics to try and decide where the problems are coming from. Yes. Maybe I'd like the person who put the question in the chat to answer his or her own question, and you could read their answer.
It's better to you show it your email. It's better to send you an email. Ask.
Well, if they provide you with their email address,
no, you show it at the end of the presentation.
Sure.
You show it. Look at the show. Go to the last slide of your presentation, and
you know it better than I do.
And the email is there.
Yes.
So there, Paul at R3 environmental. I think it will be better to ask you directly than I try to interpret them, and maybe not. And I think I'd like that you close your share screen, because we are, I don't know if Anna is still there. Anna, are you there? Because Anna, I asked Anna to close the session, but I'm not sure if Anna is there, still there. Anna, open your camera and sound if you are there. Maybe she needs to go out, and I don't know. Paul, do you like to share anything more with us? I'd like to thank you very much. I don't know who is closing this section, because the session, but I'd like to thank you a lot. And I think that Ocean, it is in the other side. I'm going to acknowledge to Professor Paul the time and the experience that shared with us. It was very important, because this, Anna, please.
Oh, I'm here.
Please close the session.
Okay.
I'm trying to say some words, but I would like that. Take the word,
Okay.
please. Take the floor.
I'm online?
Yes, you are.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for attending this webinar on sustainable and risk-based contaminated sites management. So it's up to me to close the session. I apologize because I was in YouTube, and for me it's the first time because I'm quite new in the job. My name is Ana Vieira, as Celeste told you, and I'm the new president of the Portuguese Environmental Geotechnical Committee of the Portuguese Geotechnical Society, and this is our first public event, and I think that we couldn't have started better than with such an interesting and actual and relevant topic, and with such an expert and such a prestigious professor as Professor Paul Bardos. So I'd like to thank you very much. I would like to express in my personal name and in the name of our committee a great knowledge. It was a very interesting, exhaustive and multi-perspective presentation. We are all aware that this is a very complex interdisciplinary topic, and it requires so much different approaches. Its quantification is so difficult and is so challenging. But we are all aware that we have to deal with this topic in a very robust and scientific approach. It's a question of results, so we have to fight for towards a more sustainable environment, and so it was really a pleasure to have you here, Professor. I thank you again. I would also like to acknowledge the presence of Professor Alexandre Pinto, the head of the president of the Portuguese Geotechnical Society, and of course to Celeste. She's the coordinator of land treatment working group of our committee. And she was responsible for this organization. And thank you very much, Celeste. And this is the first of a lot. I hope.
You are welcome. You are welcome.
So thank you, everyone. I'm closing. It was really a pleasure, and see you soon, I hope. Thank you, Professor, and bye, everyone.
Well, thank you, everybody, and thanks for having me.